Welcome, guys. And in this section, we'll be looking at data type casting. So, what does data type casting actually talk about? Data type casting is basically how we can convert from one data type to another data type. And we've looked at different data types that we have. We've talked about strings, integers, floats, booleans, and so on and so forth. So in this section, we'll be looking at how we can convert from one data type to the other. So the first thing I want to talk about is or are the types of data type casting that we have in Python. So in Python, we have implicit and explicit data type casting. So the implicit data type casting is actually done for us by the interpreter itself, the Python interpreter itself. So for instance, when I create a variable and I say the variable age is 45, if I check the type of this particular variable, I would say it will be of that should be print, okay, print, then type, then age. I'll see right here that the data type of this particular variable is going to be an integer. And this right here is implicit data type casting. This is automatically done by the interpreter itself. Now, if I decide to change the value here from 45 to 4.5 and I run it one more time, I'll see now that the data type has changed from what it used to be to a float right here. And if we continue doing this, probably let me wrap a string around it and a quotation rather, and that will change the data type now to a string. So that is implicit data type casting. Depending on the data type that you pass to the variable is going to take the data type of that particular value. So this is just how implicit data type is performed by Python. Now, where we are going specifically is the explicit data type casting. And this is where you have to explicitly cast your data type from one data type to another, which means you have to purposely, intentionally change that particular data type. Now, let me show you an example and we will be looking at different examples. So let's start with how we can change from a string to an integer. So we want to change from string to integer. So right here, this is an example of a data type casting. So I have here, I'll say my age is, I'll put a string here and I'll say 16. And here we have the data type being a string. So we're just going to check the type of that particular data type. And once we print that out, we can see here that this right here is a string. Let me comment out the first print statement. Okay, so let's run that one more time so that we can get it. And here we are seeing that the output we are getting here is showing us that what we are, the data type of our variable is of the class string. Now I want to convert that to an integer. And for me to do that, I'll say my age to string equals, then I'll use the int function right here. I'll just wrap it around my variable, which is my age. And then I'll print the data, the type of that particular new variable. And right here we see that previously it was of this class string. And after we cast the variable, is now giving us a class int, which shows that this particular variable here, this particular value here is no longer a string, it is now a an integer rather. So right here, this is how we perform casting. We make use of functions that we have been given in Python to perform casting. And this is just an example. So we can perform different type of casting. And here, like I said, from string to integer, we make use of the int function. Then we can also cast from string to float. So let's also look at that, from string to float. And here we make use of the float function, just like this. So I'll just copy this example, and let's just, so we won't have to, be repeating ourselves. So I'll just change this to 1.67, uh, just float, and just change these values right here. Okay, so once I run this now, we'll see right here. Okay, where's that mistake coming from? Oh, this should be float. Okay, so now, um, okay, let me see that. That should, okay, right here. Okay, so now if we run that now, we are seeing here, we are seeing initially is of class string, and after uh casting is now giving us a floating value. So that right there is how to cast from string to float. And we can do the same thing when we cast from integer to a floating value. So, okay, but before we go there, let's just convert all of this back. So we can also convert from integer back to string, and we can convert from float back to string. So for us to do that, we use the function str. So let's do that, integer to string, and do this str. Okay, so I'll say my string equals, okay, that should be integer rather, not string. So my int equals 93, and here I'll print the type of my int, and here I'll say my int to string equals, and I'll use the str function just like this to convert it to a string. Then I'm just going to print the type of that out as well. Okay, so running this now, we see here we initially have a data type of integer, and now we're having a data type of string. So let's do the same thing for float. So we also use the same thing to do that. So we're using the same function. So 93 point, yeah, how will my float to my float. Right here should be my float. I think I made a naming here. This should be my, it should be, let's say, value. Here we're actually, this is a mistake on my part. Okay, so let's just make that. So we're actually changing from um, the value to a float. So my value to float. So we are not changing from float to string. That was just a naming error right there. Okay, so once we run this now, we should also see that we are already having a float, and we easily changed to a string. Okay, so what can we also cast? Let's just look at it. We've casted from string to integer, from string to float, from integer to string, and from float to string. Now, another thing we can do is we can cast from float to an integer. We can cast from float to an integer, and I'll just show us how that works. So let's just have, I'll just have this right here, copy this. So float to integer, and we make use of the int function as well. And here we know we already have a float. So I'll say my float to int equals int of my float. Okay, so before, what I want to do at first is I want to print the result. I want to print the integer itself. Then I want to print the data type of that integer. So I'm saying my float to int, then comma, then type of my float to int. Okay, so once I run this now, I just want you to guess, what will this actually give us just this value, or will it round it up to 94? So I just want you to guess before I actually run this program. Okay, so right now we can see that here it only gives us the real aspect and it removes the decimal aspect. So that is what casting from integer to float does. So it removes the whole number aspect, and the fractional aspect it does away with it. So that is exactly how casting from float to integer works. So now let's see how casting from integer to float also works. So right here we have an integer that we want to cast to a float, and we make use of the float function. Here we have my int equals 6, and we are printing the type of that int, and that's my int. And right here we want to convert it now, so say my int to float equals float. Okay, so now just like we did here, I'm just going to also print the value out alongside the data type. So my int to float, then I'll print the type, my int to float. So once we run this, we can see right here, it adds a fractional aspect to our integer. The integer we had initially was just 6. And but because we are converting it to a float now, it now adds a decimal aspect to it. So this is how basic conversion takes place in Python. How we can cast from one data type to another, from string to float, from string to integers, from integers to float, from float to integers, and from float to strings, integers to strings. So these are just the basic type of data type casting that we can perform in Python. How we can move from one data type to another. Okay, guys, so a quick question for you guys, and I want you to drop your answers in the comment section below. What other type of casting do you think could actually be done in Python? So I'll be expecting your responses in the comment section. So don't forget to like and subscribe to this video. Thank you, guys.